Imagine a nation, once the cradle of Western civilization, where philosophers like Socrates and Plato laid the foundations of modern thought, now teetering on the edge of financial ruin. A country that, in just a few years, went from celebrating Olympic glory to begging for bailouts. Its people rioting in the streets, its economy in freefall. How does a nation with such a storied past end up selling its future to foreign creditors? What hidden forces turned Greece into a cautionary tale for the modern world? And here's the mystery. Could the same mistakes that brought Greece to its knees be unfolding again, right now, in economies you'd never suspect? Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about numbers. It's about pride, betrayal, and a ticking time bomb that could still explode. To understand the Greek debt crisis, we need to rewind to the early 2000s when Greece was riding high. The nation had just joined the Eurozone in 2001, adopting the euro as its currency. This was a big deal. The euro symbolized unity, stability, and access to one of the world's most powerful economic blocs. For Greece, a relatively small economy with a history of political instability, this was like getting a golden ticket to the global stage. But there was a catch, one that would only become clear years later. The Eurozone wasn't just a currency club, it was a system with strict rules. Countries had to keep their budget deficits below 3% of GDP and their public debt below 60% of GDP. These were the Maastricht criteria, designed to ensure fiscal discipline. Greece, however, had a problem. Its economy was built on a shaky foundation, a bloated public sector, widespread tax evasion, and a culture of political patronage. Yet, when Greece applied to join the Eurozone, it presented numbers that looked pristine. How? Through creative accounting, with help from Wall Street giants like Goldman Sachs, who engineered financial deals to mask Greece's true debt levels. This was the first twist. Greece didn't just stumble into a crisis, it was let in through a back door of deception. Key figures in this drama include Greek politicians like Prime Minister Kostas Samitis, who championed Eurozone entry, and later George Papandreou, who would inherit the fallout. On the global stage, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the European Central Bank, ECB, and the European Commission, the so-called Troika, would play starring roles. But the real story lies in how these players, along with systemic flaws in the Eurozone itself, set the stage for a crisis that would spiral out of control. The seeds of the Greek debt crisis were planted long before the euro. In the 1980s and 1990s, Greece's government spent heavily to modernize and catch up with its European neighbors. Public sector jobs ballooned, pensions were generous, and infrastructure projects, like the Athens Metro, were funded with borrowed money. Borrowing was cheap because global markets saw Greece as a safe bet, especially after it joined the Eurozone. The euro gave Greece access to low-interest loans, as investors assumed the currency's strength meant all member countries were equally secure. This was a fatal miscalculation. Greece's public debt was already high, around 100% of GDP by the early 2000s, but the adoption of the euro supercharged the problem. The government could now borrow at rates previously reserved for powerhouses like Germany. Politicians didn't hesitate. They funded lavish social programs, Olympic preparations for 2004, and a sprawling bureaucracy. Meanwhile, tax collection was a mess. Estimates suggest up to a third of Greece's economy operated off the books, with businesses and individuals dodging taxes. The government, instead of reforming, kept borrowing to plug the gaps. Here's where cause and effect kick in. Cheap credit-fueled spending, which inflated the economy artificially. Growth looked strong on paper, around 4% annually in the early 2000s, but it was a house of cards. The Eurozone's one-size-fits-all monetary policy didn't help. Interest rates set by the ECB were too low for Greece's overheating economy, encouraging more borrowing and less discipline. By 2008, Greece's debt was over 110% of GDP, and its deficit was creeping toward 10%. The stage was set for disaster, but no one saw the storm coming, yet. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, credit markets froze worldwide. Greece, heavily reliant on foreign loans, was suddenly exposed. Investors started questioning whether Greece could repay its debts. Bond yields, the interest rates Greece had to pay to borrow, began to rise. By 2009, the situation was dire. The government admitted it had misreported its deficit, which wasn't 3.7% as claimed, but a staggering 12.7%. The markets panicked, and Greece's borrowing costs skyrocketed. Enter George Papandreou, the new prime minister in 2009. He inherited a mess, but also made a bold move. He revealed the truth about Greece's finances. This transparency was meant to restore trust. But it backfired. Investors fled, and Greece's bond yields hit double digits. The country was effectively locked out of international markets. Without new loans, Greece couldn't pay its bills or its debts. The crisis was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. At this point, the Eurozone faced a dilemma. If Greece defaulted, it could trigger a domino effect, threatening other weak economies like Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. The euro itself might collapse. So, in 2010, the Troika stepped in with a €110 billion bailout. But there was a catch. The bailout came with strings attached. Greece had to implement harsh austerity measures, cutting pensions, slashing public sector wages, raising taxes, and privatizing state assets. The logic was simple. To get the money, Greece had to prove it could balance its books. But this solution would ignite a new phase of the crisis. Austerity hit Greece like a sledgehammer. By 2011, the economy was shrinking at an alarming rate, over 7% annually. Unemployment soared past 20%, with youth unemployment hitting 50%. Public anger boiled over. Protests turned into riots in Athens' Syntagma Square, with Molotov cocktails and tear gas becoming grim symbols of resistance. The Greek people felt betrayed, not just by their own government, but by the Troika, which seemed to prioritize banks and creditors over human suffering. The bailouts kept coming, another €130 billion in 2012, but they weren't saving Greece. Most of the money went to repaying foreign banks and bondholders, not rebuilding the economy. A controversial debt restructuring in 2012, the largest in history, forced private creditors to take a 50% haircut on Greek bonds. This reduced Greece's debt by about €100 billion, but it wasn't enough. The economy was in a death spiral. Austerity crushed demand, tax revenues plummeted, and the debt-to-GDP ratio climbed to 175% by 2013. The cure was killing the patient. Here's the twist. The Eurozone structure made things worse. Greece couldn't devalue its currency to boost exports, as it had done with the drachma before the euro. It was trapped in a monetary union that favored stronger economies like Germany, which benefited from a weaker euro while Greece drowned. The Troika's insistence on austerity ignored a basic economic truth. You can't grow an economy by choking it. By 2015, Greece was on the brink of leaving the Eurozone, a so-called Grexit. A referendum saw 61% of Greeks reject further austerity. But the government, led by Alexis Tsipras, capitulated to a third bailout of €86 billion. The crisis had reached its breaking point, and Greece's sovereignty was effectively sold to its creditors. The human cost was staggering. Between 2008 and 2016, Greece's GDP shrank by 25%, a collapse comparable to the Great Depression. Over 1 million Greeks, 10% of the population, emigrated, many of them young professionals, draining the country of talent. Poverty rates doubled, with a third of the population living below the poverty line by 2015. Homelessness surged, and suicide rates climbed. The Greek healthcare system, gutted by budget cuts, struggled to cope, with hospitals running out of basic supplies. Politically, the crisis reshaped Greece. Traditional parties like PASOK and New Democracy lost credibility, while radical parties like Syriza and the far-right Golden Dawn gained ground. Trust in institutions, both Greek and European, plummeted. The crisis also exposed cracks in the Eurozone. Germany's hardline stance on austerity fueled resentment, while southern European nations began questioning the benefits of the euro. The dream of European unity was fraying. Economically, Greece became a ward of the Troika. By 2018, it had received €289 billion in bailouts, but its debt-to-GDP ratio remained among the highest in the world at 180%. Privatization forced the sale of national assets, like ports and airports, to foreign investors, often at fire sale prices. Greece's future was mortgaged, its ability to chart its own course severely limited. The Troika's fixes, bailouts tied to austerity, failed to restore growth. Why? First, the focus on debt repayment over economic recovery was short-sighted. Austerity reduced Greece's ability to generate revenue, making debt repayment harder, not easier. Second, structural reforms, like labor market deregulation, often benefited corporations but did little for ordinary Greeks. Third, the Eurozone's inflexibility, its refusal to consider debt forgiveness or a looser monetary policy, trapped Greece in a vicious cycle. Alternative solutions were proposed but ignored. Economists like Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's former finance minister, argued for debt restructuring and investment-led growth. Others suggested a temporary exit from the euro to allow currency devaluation. But political realities, Germany's fear of moral hazard and the ECB's obsession with stability, prevailed. The result? Greece stabilized enough to exit bailout programs in 2018, but its economy remained fragile, its debt unsustainable, and its people scarred. The Greek debt crisis isn't just history, it's a warning. Today other nations are walking a similar tightrope. Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio is over 140%, and its economy is stagnant. The United States, with a national debt exceeding $33 trillion, 120% of GDP in 2023, relies on its global reserve currency status to keep borrowing cheap. But for how long? Emerging markets like Argentina and Turkey face currency crises and spiraling debt, echoing Greece's early warning signs. Shocking data points drive the point home. Global debt reached $305 trillion in 2022 according to the IMF, with low-income countries particularly vulnerable. The pattern is familiar: cheap credit, reckless spending, and a sudden loss of market confidence. The rise of populist movements, Brexit, Trump, and far-right parties in Europe, mirrors the political fallout in Greece, where distrust in elites fueled extremism. Even cryptocurrencies, hailed as a hedge against fiat currency failures, reflect a broader loss of faith in financial systems. The Eurozone itself remains vulnerable, its banking union is incomplete, and fiscal integration is a distant dream. If another crisis hits, the same fractures, north versus south, creditors versus debtors, could resurface. The question isn't if history will repeat, but when. So, what can we learn from Greece's tragedy? First, transparency matters. Greece's hidden deficits delayed the inevitable, making the crash worse. Honest accounting and early intervention could have softened the blow. Second, austerity alone doesn't work. Cutting spending in a recession can deepen the downturn, as Greece's 25% GDP collapse proved. Balanced policies, combining reforms with investment, are essential. Third, currency unions like the Eurozone need flexibility. Without mechanisms for debt relief or fiscal transfers, weaker members will always be at risk. The warning is clear: no economy is immune. Whether it's a small nation like Greece or a superpower like the United States, unchecked borrowing, political denial, and systemic flaws can lead to collapse. The Greek crisis showed us that pride and short-term gains can blind leaders to long-term consequences. Are we listening, or are we too busy building our own house of cards? If this story gripped you, hit that subscribe button and join the conversation in the comments. What do you think? Could your country be next? Share this video with someone who needs to hear this cautionary tale. And for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world, check out our playlist on global crises. Let's keep asking the tough questions, because the future depends on it.